Hello and welcome to the 15th video of my Pygame tutorial. Now, if you can remember last time, which shouldn't be too difficult, we were working on buttons, and we had the buttons and we had this clickable rectangle we could click. We actually had, a button we could click, and then we have a text button. But right now they're not very interactive, they don't really do much, so we want to, create some more stuff with them. We basically want them to be more interactive. Like when we mouse over them, they change a little bit. When we click them, we get some kind of click animation or some color change in them so that it's, we can tell that we clicked it, some feedback from it. Well, to do that, we're going to start with the clickable rect again, and we're going to just add some more stuff to it. So we have an isClicked and a doClick. We're going to create some other stuff for this in the update. So when we update our buttons, or any clickable rect for that matter, we need to check a few things. And one of those are going to be if self.isMouseOver. So if we're mouse over, so if our mouse is over the object, we're going to say self.doMouseOver. And again, this is just an action much like the isClicked one. And then there's going to be one more that we're going to have that we're going to be implementing. And that's going to be if self.is left mouse down, meaning is the left mouse button being pressed, then do self.do left mouse down. And of course, these functions should be pretty explicit on what we want to do with them. So we have clicking. Now we just need do mouse over. Let's see, is mouse over. We'll create the function right below it. So define do mouse over. So what happens when we mouse over a clickable rect? Well, for this example, we don't want anything to happen. What we want to happen is it's the button that we want to be able to do something during do mouse over, because the button is the thing with the image and that's what happens. Now, what we can do is with do mouse over, we can say something, like print you moused over a rect, and then we can just leave it at that so that we can get some type of feedback that we have in fact moused over it. And I just thought this isn't going to run because we haven't done these two functions yet. So we'll create these before we run it, but we're not going to add anything to them yet. So is left mouse button down. So let's put this between the clickings, so right here should be good. So define is left mouse button down. And this one is actually really easy to implement because we're checking a single thing. Return self.hasClicked. Now, the reason I'm doing it this way and creating its own function, even though it's just returning a variable, is because maybe we wanted some other thing to happen in this function to check. Maybe we wanted a more complex search than just checking hasClicked. However, hasClicked, basically, this is the result of it. Because if you remember, hasClicked is being interacted with the isClicked method, or the function we have. And we're saying if the left mouse button is down and we haven't clicked, then set the click to true, which means the left mouse button is currently down. And if the left mouse button goes up and our click is true, then our click is going to become false. So basically, hasClicked is true as long as we have clicked the mouse button down coming from the mouse button being up. So you'll see that in action later, but it's pretty much the exact thing we want for this. And then we have to define a very similar function, except instead of is left mouse down, this one is going to be do. I believe we called it do, or did we call it on? Yeah, do left mouse button down. And I'm just going to pass for this one, because again, the do left mouse button down, when our left mouse button is being held down, then what's happening is that's when we want, the button to change color. So for example, if we run the example from last time, then while the left mouse button is down, this thing is green. And then when we click, it turns green, but it stays green as long as it's down. While we're mousing over it, it changes to a lighter color. This is kind of what we want. Now, if we just checked the on click for changing to green, then it would change green for a single frame and then turn back red, even if we were holding the left mouse button down. Because remember, the click only happens one time for a single frame. That's all it lasts. The on left mouse button down lasts as long as our left mouse button remains held down. So that's the difference between the two of them. So like I said, we're going to pass for now, and we're going to focus on the on mouse over, or the do mouse over. So you moused over a rect. Actually, I don't think I showed that, but I can. So let's mouse over it. You moused over a rect. And of course, it returns true for every frame that we're mousing over the rect. You can create another trigger so that an event happens the first time you mouse over the rectangle, and when you leave the rectangle, you can create events for that. But for this, we don't really need events for when we mouse over them, so it's not going to be too much of a concern for us. So how about we just pass this? Because we don't need it anymore. So on mouse over, well, our button actually needs to override this one, because this is one we care about. This is one where we change the image. So define do mouse over. So what are we going to do here? Well, we need a new thing. I'm going to call this an overlay, and this is going to be a pygame.surface of self.rect.size, which is, the size of our rectangle, because we want it to be a surface of the exact same size as our image. Then we're going to say overlay.set_alpha to, let's try 60. Of course, this is trial and error to make sure that this looks good. And overlay.fill with black. And then we're going to say self.image.fill, or self.image.blit overlay at 0, 0. And what this is going to do is this is going to fit a black, sort of alpha'd out. So what's going to happen is when we mouse over, it's going to become darker. So it's going to be set a black overlay over the image when we mouse over it. And we set the alpha to 60, where 255 is, completely opaque, and 0 is completely transparent. So 60 should make it darker, but we should still clearly be able to see the button beneath it. So let's run this and see. So now the buttons look normal, nothing different about them, but when we mouse over them, they become darker. Now, one thing you'll notice is when I mouse over, they become darker and they stay darker. Why is that? Well, that has to do with how we're updating and drawing these things. So, when we update our main game loop in our actual game, if you remember, what happens is the first thing we do is we actually blank out the screen. So we do this, self.gamewindow.fill utils.white. We blank out the screen, we draw everything, then we update. In this example, with our text boxes, we're not blanking them out. We're not redrawing them every single frame, but we need to. So when we call our update, this is the update that gets called for our two visible buttons, our button and our text button. We're doing a draw, and then we're doing a clickable rect.update. So here's a couple problems with this. One, we draw it first, meaning we blit it to the game window before we update it. Now, this is a problem because a lot of our updates are updates based on the single frame. For example, when we click, if we change the color, the click is only good for one frame. So if we draw it to the screen, then we check if it's clicked, and we change its color to green or something, then it's going to be green, and then when we draw it again, it's not going to be green because we need to blank it before we draw it. So we're going to have to do a very similar style to how we do the normal game window. So what we're going to say is self.image.fill self.color, and I'm going to call this way for a reason. We're going to come back up here and add another variable called self.color. We're going to say self.color equals color, and then I'm just going to say self.color because we don't need to access that one twice. And now we have self.color stored, because remember, these are only good for initializing the button, but we want this during the update of the button, meaning we need to grab a copy of it. So self.color, we're going to fill it with self.color when we update. We're not going to draw immediately. What we're going to do instead is we're actually going to call the clickable rect.update. So we're going to update our clickable rect, meaning we're going to do all of, the mouse over, all the clicking action, and then the very last thing we do is we're going to draw ourselves. That's how the button and the text button are going to work. It's the exact same way our game window works. So now their color should work the way we want it to. So let's run this again. Test it out, mouse over. You can see it becomes a little bit darker. In truth, you probably can't, so let me just make it even darker so it's easier for you guys to see. How about 120? That should make it very noticeable. Now we'll run it. Now you see when we mouse over these buttons, they become darker to kind of let us know that our mouse is hovering over this button and it's ready to be clicked versus when it's not. So now we should be able to, all we have to do is add some type of clicking animation because, I'm clicking it right now, but it's not doing anything to kind of tell me it's clicked other than this over here. But in a game, you don't want, console log to tell you if it's being clicked or not. What you want is the button to act a certain way to kind of show you that it's been clicked. So where are we going to add the clicking action? Well, the click happens for only a single frame. That means it's not very good to try and draw something. I mean, it will change color for a single frame, yes. It's perfectly valid for us to say something like self.image.fill, green, for example. In which case, if we were to run this now, and we were to click these, they turn green for a single frame. That's not exactly what we want from them. We don't want them to turn green for a single frame. So doing it on the click action isn't where we want to draw it. Maybe you do want it to draw for a single frame, in which case this is perfectly fine. It's all right to do that. But what we want to do is we want to draw as long as our left mouse button is down. So we have our is left mouse button down. So, we have something to return that to be true. And then we have do left mouse button down. This, of course, is just passing because the rectangle doesn't do anything in this situation. The rectangle could do something in this situation, the clickable rect, but for our example, it's not. However, the button is going to do something, so we need to grab this function. So we have do mouse over. So when the mouse is over it, it does something. And we also need this one. So do left mouse. So when the left mouse button is down, what do? Well, let's change the color. So let's just, something very simple. Self.image.fill. Let's do the exact same example, green. So on left mouse button down, right here, is left mouse button down? If it is, then do the left mouse button down function. So let's check our button. We mouse over, changes color. We click, it turns green. We get one instance of you clicked a button. Now it stays green as long as we've held it. I think this is fine. If you move your mouse around a lot and you're still holding down the left mouse button, you've still only clicked this button. But if you release anywhere, then this is where it stops. Now here's one issue that we still might want to fix, is see how the left mouse button is down? It says you clicked a button, and we can click multiple buttons. So you clicked a button, you clicked a rect. Well, I didn't actually click that rect. I just kind of moused over it with the left mouse button down. This is one of the issues about how we're handling the click, because every button has its own self.hasClicked, which means everything can be clicked all at the same time. That's something that can happen. We can click a button, we can click a rect, and we can click the text button. That's something we can do, and you can actually see it in the console how it turns up. And maybe that's not something we want to do. Maybe what we want to do is only have a single click action. But for now, we have the buttons working how we kind of expect them to, how we want them to. You click it, changes color, gives you the feedback. We still need to work on actions, and we do need to fix that has clicked issue. Now, to set it up so that we can't click more than one button at one time, we have to not really change anything, but we have to add something. So, in order for a mouse to happen, we have to be mousing over the object, and we need to be clicking. Now, when we click, our mouse has to be down, and our self.hasClicked has to be false. We need an additional check. We also have to say, and basically we're not interacting with something else. So what I'm going to say is, how would I word this? and interact equals false. Or I should say and not interact. And interact is going to be a variable we create in a little bit. That's going to be a global to tell us what we're interacting with. So in order to click, our mouse needs to be down, our self.hasClicked has to be false, and we have to not be interacting with something. So what is interact? Well, interact is going to be a global, much like variables up here, and I'm going to set it equal to none. Now, when we ask if we're interacting with something, and none comes up, what's going to happen is it's going to go and not none. Now that statement, the way it's worded that way, is probably confusing because it sounds like we're saying all this has to happen and interact is not none, and not none. Well, not none is actually returns true because none would return false by itself. And we're saying and not false, meaning that when it's none, it returns false. When it's knotted, it's inverted, so it returns true. Which means if this thing is empty, it returns true. That's the baseline of what this means. So if interact has nothing in it, then interact will return true. So what do we do with that? Well, self.hasClicked, and then I'm going to say interact equals self. And what this says is we're assigning interact equal to whatever we are. And what we are is either, a clickable rect, a button, or a text button. But we don't quite know that. And then, of course, when our button gets released, what we're going to say is interact equals none. Because then, of course, we're not interacting with this anymore. Now you could do an individual, check such as has clicked, except on the global level. However, I like to do interact because that tells me the object I am actually interacting with. Say, for example, if this was an RTS game and I had, a foot soldier and an archer for my units. Well, if I left click on an archer and I start dragging it around and I want to paint my mouse over the archers to select only archers, then I could use the interact. For example, I could say if I'm interacting with an archer, then, allow me to select other archers, meaning it'd be like how our buttons were working. However, if it's a foot soldier, don't interact with it. So this is just a way of letting me be able to interact with it. Now, we're getting an error here because, unresolved reference, and I think I'm spelling a couple of them differently. Maybe, probably not. So, interact. What that actually needs to be is we need to make it a global. So we need to say global interact. And now, this specifies we're going to use the global variable called interact. And the global variable is the one that has no tabbing whatsoever, that has the correct name. So now when we run this, it should work. Let's see. We can click on 1, change the color, changes back. We can click on text button, change the color, changes back. We have the mouse over effects. Can we click on 2? No, we can't. We cannot click on 2 anymore, and we don't get any weird errors with it. And even when we mouse over them, they don't tell us we've clicked them. So now we successfully blocked our ability to accidentally, click multiple at one time because we've created this global variable that tells us what's happening. And our global variable is also telling us which one we're clicking on. Now, for this example, and for the game we're making, it's probably not valid, but if we ever do something like an RTS, then that painting over a certain type of unit, that's incredibly useful. That's very valid for this. Now let's talk about actions. So when we click the buttons, in our actual game, when we push the buttons, we want them to do something. Instead of just saying you click the button, we want them to do something. So do click. What is do click going to do? Well, it's actually going to perform the action of the button, but how do we tell what that is? Well, we pass it through. So when we create our button, we need to give it one more argument. We need to give it something I'm going to call an action. And then we need to store that action somewhere. So self.action is going to equal the action. So now we're able to, we store what our action is. And then on doClick, what we're going to actually say is we're going to say self.action, but we're going to give it parentheses. Why are we going to do this? Why this isn't a function? Why are we giving it parentheses? Well, Python doesn't really care if something is a function. It can actually assign a variable name to a function, or assign a function to a variable name. So what we're going to be passing through the button is a function, and we're going to be storing that function so that we can use the function later on. And what this means when we say self.action with the parentheses, this means we're calling a function. That's what it's telling the compiler. So how do we do this? Well, one, when we call our button, we need to give it an action. So we need to fix up our text button a little bit, call action here, and of course pass through action. So our text button also takes an action, and we just need to add them here. So our normal button's action, what should we call it? Well, how about we call this one print? We'll just say print button. That's going to be the name of that action. And I'm not going to put parentheses because we're not doing a function call. We're just naming a function. And for the text button, let's go with, I don't know, play game. Because maybe that's something we want a text button to do. And maybe instead of this being called button 3, we want to call this one play. That's perfectly valid. So what are these two functions? Well, they need to be created. They're actual functions that need to already exist that we create. So define print button, takes no arguments, and print button, what is it going to do? Well, it's going to print something like hello, I am a button. And that's all this function is going to do. Our other function, define play game, is just going to print something else that we can see the difference between them. Print your game has started. So now we have an idea. And of course, these are no longer errors because that's what we're passing through. We're giving it functions to do. These are the functions that we're going to give it, and these are the functions that are going to become the button's job. So on click, it's going to do that action. Let's run it and see this. So now, these buttons have been given actions, and when we click them, they're going to do that action. So, hello, I am a button. When we click this button. Now when we click the text button that was given a different action, we click it, your game has started. So now, it's giving us different results based on what these are. So here's the thing about this. Now say we wanted a bunch of text buttons. For example, let's change this one up. Let's make our normal button, the one that's been sitting in the middle of our screen, a text button too. And let's add some text to it. So we're going to say, just call it quit or something. Doesn't really matter what the text is. Make sure it's all syntactically correct. And now let's run it. Now it's still being given print button as its function. But now when we click it, it's still going to say hello, I am a button. And play is still going to say your game has started. They're both text buttons. In the previous way that this was being handled, where we would call the action, so when we called the on do click, when we just printed something here, it would print the same thing. So it'd be the same if we were to do it, something like this. If we did define do click, and we just said print hello, with a Y of course, then what's going to happen is it's always just going to print the simple hello. Because they're both text buttons, this is the bottom level action, this is the bottom level do click method, so they're both going to print the same thing. They're both text buttons, they're both going to listen to this function call. Now, because they're both text buttons, they're also both listening to this function call, define do click. They're both doing this. However, their self.action is different from each other. So even though they're listening to a single function call, they're doing different things. And of course, these actions can do more than just printing. We can actually have them, start the game, for example. So say in our main game here, right? Which is what we're going to work on next time, is implementing these things. When we have our, let's see, where is our start, our menu? Okay, go to menu. So when we're up here, what we do normally is we wait for the cue to be pressed before our game starts. What we would do instead is we would wait for this button. We would draw our buttons here in this zone. We would draw them all. And when one of those buttons got pushed, menu right here would get set to equal, or get set to true. In which case, once menu becomes false, I should say, sorry, then once menu becomes false from these buttons interacting with it, then what happens is the menu becomes false and we drop out of the menu based on a button's action or a button's trigger. So that's how that works, and that's how we're going to be using them. Of course, this requires the functions to be defined ahead of time. There's no good way to define the actual action in this slot. Like you can't say, define new action and then name it. There's no good way to handle this in Python. Some languages, programming languages, will allow you to actually define a function as a parameter, but Python isn't one of them. So we just have to create an action and, actually call it. Now, we'll not call it, but give its name as the parameter so that we can pass the action through it. Now what's going to happen in the next video is we're actually going to get back into our main game, and we're going to start implementing these buttons, and we're going to start implementing the actions for the buttons and everything so that they're going to start working, so that we can actually get the game menu rolling, so we can have a menu that lets us click a play button or a quit button that actually does something. And also so that what happens is we'll be able to implement other clickable type objects inside of our menu. Like maybe we want, some type of chest to have like a 1% chance to spawn on an enemy's death. And then we left click on that chest, which would be like a clickable rect. And when we left click on the chest, then it gives us a few extra words for our player's inventory. Maybe something like that. I don't know. Maybe we'll work on that just to kind of show you what I was talking about, how the reason we create the button based off a clickable rect is because a clickable rect could be used for multiple things. Anyway, that's going to be the end of this one. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time.